Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. I'm Bruce Lascelles, President of the British Society of Soil Science, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to the second webinar that we've held this year. But before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to introduce you to the British Society of Soil Science as the host of today's webinar. So we are an established international membership organisation and charity committed to the study of soil in its widest aspects. We bring together those working within academia and have a growing membership amongst practitioners implementing soil science in industry and those with a keen interest in soils. So today's event is supported by Visit Britain and Nature Scot, who are both also supporting the World Congress of Soil Science this year, which is held later on this summer. For those who may not be aware, that Congress, the World Congress of Soil Science, is the leading international soil science conference. It's held every 4 years in different countries, and it was last in the UK in 1936. And it's attended by over 3,000 soil scientists from around the globe. And the next Congress this year is going to be held between the 31st of July and the 5th of August in Glasgow. And it's being organised by ourselves, the British Society of Soil Science, on behalf of the International Union of Soil Sciences. Registration is available on the Congress website, and for those interested, the early bird rate is available until the 15th of March. Nature Scot is Scotland's nature agency and work to improve the natural environment in Scotland and inspire everyone to care more about it so that all nature in Scotland is maintained, enhanced, and brings us benefits. And Nature Scot delivered an amazing exhibition stand at COP26 last year in Glasgow, where they highlighted the diversity of the Scottish landscape, which showed the various soil and plant types found throughout Scotland. And we're absolutely thrilled that Nature Scot will be delivering the same exhibition at the World Congress of Soil Science later this year, and will provide delegates with an opportunity to ask their experts more about Scottish diversity. And we hope to hear more about them at our April Zoom into Soil webinar, when we'll be discussing the peatlands of Scotland. So just before we begin, just some basic housekeeping. As there are so many of you here today, all your microphones have been muted. We will be taking questions at the end of both presentations, and my colleague Willie will monitor these for us. But could I ask that you please submit any questions you have by 12:50 to allow us sufficient time to get through as many as we can. And although there is a raise your hand button, we won't be using this unless the presenter specifically asks for a show of hands. And today's presentations have also been awarded BASIS and NROSO CPD points. So if you're registered with either of those bodies, please contact us directly after the event. And finally, just before I introduce the presenters, please be aware that today's presentation is being recorded. So it's my pleasure now to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Allan Lilly. Allan has over 40 years experience in soil survey and soil mapping, hydropedology and biophysical resource analysis, and has been responsible for systematic soil survey and data collection in Scotland. Allan currently leads research into estimating the hydrological characteristics of soils from existing data and integrating these data into spatially scaled models. He also derives and interprets soil data from a wide range, for a wide range of purposes, and has recently contributed to developing new soil and hydrological data sets using digital soil mapping techniques. His current research also encompasses the estimation and status of carbon stocks in soils. So over to you, Allan.
Bruce, you hear me okay? Yeah, so thanks for that introduction. Now, can you see my screen with the presentation?
Yeah, we can see your screen, Allan.
Okay, fine. So what I want to do today is just to give a brief overview of the soils in Scotland. And how we classify the soils and what types of soils we have. Now, I have gone, so hopefully you can still hear me.
We can hear you,
So,
Alan, thank you.
Good, thank you for that. Okay, so why characterising soils? Why is it important? Well, soil is a finite resource. I mean, we all know that. It needs to be carefully managed to retain its functionality. There's also many conflicting interests in using land: farming, forestry, recreation, wind farms and infrastructure. Systematic soil survey and the data that's collected along with that helps to characterise and quantify this major resource. And it also provides a basis for sound decisions in land use and management to be made. And systematic classification of soils also allows expertise in modelling and experimental data to be extrapolated from one area to another without the need for further experimentation or modelling. So just a bit of brief history about the Soil Survey of Scotland. Soil Survey began in 1938. The Soil Survey Department formed in 1947. And between then and about 1986, effectively, we were doing systematic soil survey throughout Scotland in order to characterise the soils. The initial work was in surveying land for forestry, particularly in relating to tree growth. But the outbreak of World War II led to the focus switching to agricultural production. And essentially most of the survey from then until the late 70s was in agricultural land. The focus now is on making soils data much more accessible or on using that data to help quantify change. So as well as mapping soils, we also collected information on soil characteristics, which now form part of the Scottish Soils database. Just a wee bit about field mapping. In Scotland, we adopted a free survey approach. So inspection pits were dug where a surveyor felt the need to dig to try and distinguish between different soil types. They generally built up an understanding of how soils varied in the landscape, so they developed a conceptual model. They found there was good relationships between vegetation and soils and uncultivated land, which also helped with the mapping. And just at the bottom of the slide here is just some output of what we call the field sheets. It just shows the detail of inspection that went into making a soil map. Each of those marks is an inspection pit. In the process of mapping, as I mentioned earlier, we concentrated primarily on the agricultural land in Scotland. You can see in this slide here in the bottom left, this is primarily the cultivated land in Scotland, and that's where the focus for much of the mapping was. In the late 70s, we then did a much more reconnaissance survey of that kind of white area you see there, that blank area, and produced a map at 1 to 250,000 scale, which covers the whole of the country. So as well as mapping the soils, we also collected soil profiles. Now these profiles were used to characterize the map units. They weren't used in the mapping itself. And the map in the top right there shows the distribution of the soil profiles that we have in the database. And each of these profiles, we collected about 100 attributes. So there's the contextual data, things like the slope and the altitude. There's the morphological data, so the color, the mottling, the texture, the structure. And then there's the lab analysis as well. Oops. So this profile database, as I say, we use this for characterizing the map units, not for mapping. It also includes the National Soils Inventory data, selected profiles, grid, transect, and research, and even some archaeological profiles. We have somewhere around about 15,000 profiles in the database and about 60,000 soil horizons. So while most of the analytical data is now stored electronically, not all the morphological data is, and that's something that hopefully redress somewhere in the future. We also have data from soil fertility experiments that ran from 1950s to the 1980s. So quite a lot of data has been collected over the years. But just to go back to soil survey and the specific soil types that you find in Scotland, and it's useful just to consider the relevant soil forming factors. I mean, most people will know this, that soils form due to the impact of climate, topography or landscape, the parent material, the vegetation, the animals that's in it, and including man, and also that soils develop over time. So I'll just quickly go through some of the aspects that have affected soil development in Scotland. So the first thing to do is to go back to the glacial history. And about 22,000 years ago, most of the British Isles was under a vast ice sheet. Beneath this ice sheet, the glaciers were carving out the landscape. They were deepening valleys, they were straightening valleys, they were deepening them as well. And in some cases, they're remolding the landscape and depositing glacial till underneath it as well. So that's where you get the drumlin fields. The climate warmed and the ice retreated. And then about 12,500 years ago, we had another ice sheet, ice cap developed on the Western Highlands here, and much of Scotland was under periglacial conditions. But essentially what this has done is it's reset the time for soil formation in Scotland to around about 12 to 15,000 years, which is not a long time in terms of pedology or pedogenesis. Between the ice ages and now, the climate changed. It fluctuated between warm and wet, cool and dry, and whatever. But the current climate that we have, you can see here that essentially we're relatively cool compared to the rest of the UK, and we're relatively wet compared to the rest of the UK. And this has had consequences for the soils that we see in Scotland now. Topography is an important characteristic in determining the soil types. Scotland is primarily a kind of hilly area. We have 52 of the 56 peaks in the UK that are over 1,000 metres, and we have 90 of the top 100 highest hills in the UK, and in fact in the British Isles. So in relative terms, our altitudes tend to be greater than what you would find in England and elsewhere in the UK. The parent material, an important consideration in development of soils, and here we have a simplified map from the British Geological Survey showing the main structural, geological structural areas in Scotland. So in the south here we have the Southern Uplands boundary fault and an area of metamorphic grey wackies. Within the Midland Valley here, we have carboniferous sediments and old red sandstone sediments to the north. North of the Highland boundary fault, we have largely acid schists, metamorphic schists. And then in the extreme northwest, at Des Moines Thrust, we have some really ancient rocks, Lewisian gneiss and Torridonian sandstones. Lewisian gneiss is some of the oldest rocks that you actually find in the world. The red areas here are intrusive granites, and you could probably barely see the pink areas here are extrusive basalts. So all of this has had an impact on the type of parent material that we find in Scotland. So superimposed in this, and I mentioned the glaciation through the Midland Valley here, this blue area you see, we have fairly compact glacial till laid down by the ice. So this is where you get sort of drumlin fields. And by and large, the rest of the material that we find is a kind of loamy acid drift derived from these highland rocks, and a few pockets of peat in these areas here down in the southwest as well. So geological parent material is particularly important in Scotland as drift is rarely moved that far from the parent rock. And in fact, our soil associations in Scotland are based largely on rock type and stratigraphy. And that's quite important, and Ben might pick up on that in his presentation. Also, land cover is important. Nowadays, we've got about 12% of arable land, about 13% of the land is under grassland, around 18% is forestry. But between the last glaciation and up until about the late Neolithic and the early Bronze Age, most of Scotland was covered in trees, in woodland, whether that was broadleaf woodland or the coniferous pinewood of the Caledonian woodland. So in summary, we have cool, wet climate, high altitudes, loamy acid drifts, and little time for soil development. And all that's an impact on the types of soils that we see in Scotland. So just a brief word about the soil classification system. It's little altered since we started doing systematic soil survey. In 2013, we had a go at trying to amalgamate the various aspects of it. When we started to bring together the different data sets, the 1 to 250,000 scale mapping, the 1 to 25,000 scale mapping, and the soil database, we found that there were slight differences within the classification system, simply because it had evolved over time. In 2013, as I say, we had another look at it, and we currently have a hierarchical classification system that comprises of 5 divisions, 17 major soil groups, 49 major soil subgroups, and we identify over 800 soil series. And just an example of a division, whether a soil is leached or whether it's glade, a major soil subgroup, whether it's podzolic or whether it's something like a rancor, major soil subgroup, humus iron podzol. And the soil series tend to be named after the area where they're first encountered. And this name is it's a shorthand way of saying a humus iron podzol with free drainage developed on drift derived from granite. So rather than having all that, we just say count as well series. So the classification system is descriptive, it's genetic, it's based on how we think the soil has developed, and it's field-based. It doesn't rely on diagnostic criteria and doesn't rely on any lab analysis. So all the soil forming factors give us quite a complex pattern of soils in Scotland, and this is the 250K soil map, and you can see the different soil types throughout the country. So what common soil types do we have? Well, because the soil, because it's wet, climate's wet, the parent materials are acidic, they haven't developed over a particularly long period of time, then it's no great surprise that the majority of our soils are either peats, immature soils like brown earths, or peaty glaic soils, or podzolic soils. And this slide here just shows the top 6 by area that we find in Scotland, grouped into a larger soil type grouping just for ease of showing. But for example, the peats include blanket peat, basin peat, and valley peats. Brown earths are free and imperfectly drained brown earths. Now, what I've also done is put in the world reference-based classification system. And this is just indicative. Don't take this as being gospel, because there isn't a straight one-to-one classification between the Scottish classification and the WRB. And you can see here for things like mineral glaze, it could be either stagnic or clay soils. So it's not, as I say, it's not a one-to-one, it's just for an example, really. We also have some notable soils that are of limited extent, and these include our Oroarctic podsoils, some resinas, and calcareous regosoils, and I'll deal with them in a bit later. So just some examples of the soil types that we have. Some illustrations here. We see we've got peats. On the left-hand side here, this peat is about 1 metre deep, probably a bit deeper than that. Classify that as a deep peat. On the top right, again, a peat soil, but this time it's a bit shallower, but it's more than our 50 centimetre threshold. So anything with an organic surface layer greater than 50 centimetres, we classify as peat. And one of the reasons for that is that if you look at the relationship between the soil and the vegetation, what you actually see is that there are specific vegetation communities that grow on peats that are 50 centimetres or more, and those are different than the vegetation communities that grow on the peaty soils where the organic surface layer is 50 centimetres or less. The brown earths. Now, the brown earths can either be cambosols, or in some cases they might be classified as umbrasols. But you can see here that there's not much in the way of development within the soil. Some colour change within the B horizon. You can see an organic rich topsoil here, and not much alteration in colour or weathering within the subsoil, and then the parent material beneath here. Because we've got a cool and wet climate, then we got a lot of peaty clay soils. They could be either histic clay soils or histic stagnosols. Here on the left-hand side, you see the peat is very wet, and the flooding that you see here is actually due to water seeping out at the interface between the organic surface layer and the mineral material here. So this is a stagnic soil, stagnosol here. What I've called mineral podsols are what we call the humus iron podsols, where the organic layer is not wet. It just develops because climate is cool. But you can see quite clearly the leached layer in here and the redeposited iron here. So the iron has been removed from this grey material here and redeposited in the profile here. So quite a classic humus iron podzol. Where the soil gets cultivated, then you find that there's a mixture of the upper layers, but you can still see the bright orange BS horizon, sesquite oxide rich horizon here. So these are quite common. Quite a lot of the soils in North of Highland boundary fault that are cultivated are actually cultivated podsols. Oops, gone too far. So where do you get wet material, where an iron pan forms, you can see here, then we have soils that we call peaty clay podsols. These are the histic podsols. And you can see in this example here on the left-hand side, you sometimes can get quite a convoluted iron pan. So the actual iron pan here is coming along this part here, up round here, round, and up through there. It's quite a complex profile to describe. You've got an organic layer here, a leached layer here, it's also stretching down in here, and your iron pan, and then your BS, your sesqui oxide rich subsoil here. Quite a complex profile, quite an unusual one to find. Here we have the mineral glaze soils, where the soils are wet, but essentially having a mineral topsoil. And you can see here where the material has been leached out in these grey patches between the bed faces. And in this picture here in the middle, you can see where the material again, where some of the iron has been oxidized and reduced patches as well. You can see the mottling here, and similarly here in this side here on the right hand side. So these soils are essentially stagnosols. So what you find is that the material is quite compact. This is this compact till that holds the water up and restricts the drainage. And just going into some of the last slides here, I see my time is almost up. The oroarctic podsols I mentioned earlier, some of the rendzinas we have here, shallow soils and limestone. And just a notable exception here, this profile is a podsol that's developed in only the top 12 centimeters of soil. And this finally, the last soil, some of the benefits of working in Scotland, working up in the Highlands in nice sunny days. Some of the disbenefits, having to dig through some fairly hard, stony soils where you feel as if you're a quarryman rather than a soil scientist. And I'll stop there. That seems to be my time up.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alan. That was fantastic and great to see that range of soils and the beauty of the soils that are in Scotland as well. So we'll be taking questions, as I said, for both speakers at the end of the session. So I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Ben Butler. Ben is a digital soil mineralogist at the James Hutton Institute, where his research focuses on understanding the physical, chemical and biological roles of minerals within soil systems. A key component of Ben's current research is the use of open source, data-driven approaches that quantitatively link soil mineralogy to soil properties and functions. Aside from his research, Ben is involved in soil survey work for Forestry and Land Scotland, allowing him to study soil information from the digging to the databases. So over to you, Ben.
Great, thank you, Bruce. Hope you can hear me and see my screen now. Yeah, over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to give a very broad overview to the mineralogy of Scottish soils. Let me just get my screen back. Right, so Scotland is actually a very interesting place to study soil mineralogy because of its diverse geological history, as Alan touched upon. Means that, especially for its size, there are a lot of different minerals that you can expect to find in Scottish soils. So in this talk, I'm going to start with an introduction to what I actually mean by minerals before looking at how the parent material ends up becoming the soil and the soil mineral composition. And that would lead us nicely onto looking at soil associations, which are actually a key part of the whole talk, really, as we'll see. And we'll briefly look at the technique that I always use to study soil mineral compositions quantitatively, which is X-ray powder diffraction. Once all that's out of the way, we'll actually move on to looking at the main groups of minerals that are found in Scottish soils, their properties and their spatial distributions across the country before wrapping up with a quick summary. So then what I mean by minerals is pretty simple. They're naturally occurring solid and organic substances that have a well-constrained chemical composition and specific crystal structures. So ordered arrays of atoms create these crystal structures that form minerals. And they're the main component of most soils in the world by volume. Even in Scotland, where we have a lot of peats and peaty soils, the minerals are still the main component of the ground beneath our feet, really. And the composition of the minerals within the soils is intricately linked to nearly all soil properties and the way they function. So understanding the soil mineral composition can really help you understand why your soil and our soils behave the way they do. So the minerals observed within a given soil are usually either there firstly by being inherited from the parent material the soil is formed from, or they can also be the products of aqueous alteration of those minerals. By chemical weathering, some minerals within the soil will weather to other minerals like clay minerals and iron oxides. So in Scotland, these two processes are the main processes that result in the soil mineral composition. And in my experience of looking at Scottish soils, you could expect to find between 5 and 20 detectable mineral groups within a single soil. So they can be the compositions can be pretty complex, but nonetheless, it's entirely possible to get a really good idea of what's within them quantitatively. A final note on this slide is that in Scotland, what we generally find is that the minerals within the soil very strongly reflect the minerals that make up the original parent material that the soil is formed from. And that goes back to what Alan was saying about how soils in Scotland are relatively young, 12 to 15,000 years, which isn't really that long in the grand scheme of things to produce these alteration products, these new clay minerals and iron oxides, compared to places in the world where the soils might have had hundreds of thousands or millions of years to form and be altered. So there's a very strong relationship between the parent material and the soil mineral composition in Scotland, as we'll see. And quite usefully for this talk, we can kind of group soil mineral compositions across Scotland into polygons of soil associations. And these plotted on a map are just polygons of soils that have developed from a similar parent material, really. And across Scotland, there are over 100 associations, which is quite a lot for the size of the country, the largest of which extends for about 12,500 square kilometres. And there are quite a few small ones as well, which might only be a couple of kilometres squared. But in this map, I've actually shown just 20 of the largest soil associations, and they cover about 80% of the total land, which helps simplify things as well for the sake of this talk. And in this talk, I'm going to be presenting quantitative estimates of soil mineral concentrations of Scottish soils. And I'm going to be presenting data from 42 of these soil associations plotted on this map in various colours. And these cover about 85% of Scotland, so not quite everything, but nonetheless we'll get a pretty good idea of the main patterns that occur in soil mineral compositions across the country. And an important point to note is that in the data that I'm presenting, I'm going to present basically weight percentages of minerals within the soil, and those weight percentages are of the mineral fraction alone. So that excludes the organic matter from the overall composition. So that's quite important to note that when looking at the maps. So before we look at the data, I just want to touch upon the way in which we can study the mineralogy of soils in such detail. And the technique we use for that is called X-ray powder diffraction. Now, this technique makes use of the way in which X-rays interact with the regular atomic arrangement in crystal structures to create a unique signature for every mineral in existence, really. And in a soil, you would get a pattern, a diffraction pattern that might look something like this. And you can use the locations of the peaks in the pattern and their intensities relative to one another to identify what minerals are within your soil, and also to then work out the concentration of those minerals. So I've been looking at hundreds of these patterns for soils across Scotland over the past 5 years or so, working as a soil mineralogist at the James Hutton Institute. And I've quantified concentrations of minerals across the country. And what I've found and what I'll present today is that there are 7 mineral groups that account for about 90% of the soil mineral compositions by mass in Scotland. So these give a very, just introducing these today will give us quite a good picture of the main groups that you can expect to find. There are others, other minor phases, which are interesting, but I just won't have time to squeeze them in today. So in order of average abundance, we have first quartz, second plagioclase, third the muscovite and illite group, fourth potassium feldspar, fifth we have mixed layer illite smectite minerals, sixth we have kalinites and kalin minerals, and in 7 we have chlorites. And what I've shown here is the unique signatures of these mineral groups that you get from the diffraction data. So quartz has a very simple pattern with discrete peaks, which contrasts greatly to the kind of disordered and broad peaks that you get with mixed layer clay minerals. And if you were to observe a soil with all 7 groups, you could simply model the pattern as a sum of all these pure patterns, which would create something like this, which looks incredibly complex but can be broken down simply to the sum of these pure phases within it. And that's how you identify and quantify minerals within soil. So the rest of the talk now will look at these 7 groups individually and their variation across the country. So we'll start with quartz, which is the most common mineral in Scottish soils and in soils across the world. You'd be hard pressed to find a soil that doesn't have any quartz in it. It's simply silicon dioxide. It doesn't really offer any nutritional benefits to the soil or the plants that inhabit it, as it's pretty much chemically inert. It's very resistant to physical breakdown as well, so you would usually find the quartz in the sand-sized fraction of the soil. So soils richer in quartz are generally quite sandy. And if we look at the map of the quartz distribution across the country, we find that in general, quartz accounts for about 50% of the minerals in our soils, but there are a few soil associations that stand out on this map. We've got just in the central belt here below Edinburgh, we've got the Darvel Association, which is soils developed from fluvioglacial sands and gravels, which are about 80% quartz. Up on the Moray Firth, we've got a small association called the Nig Association, which is raised beaches along the coast, which are very sandy, 75% quartz. And then on the Isles of Islay and Jura, we have the Durnhill Association, where the soils have developed from quartzite, a metamorphic rock rich in quartz. So they're all really rich in quartz, but the real outlier in a Scottish context is the Darleith Association, which shows up as white patches on the map. And these are soils developed from tertiary basalts, and these only have less than 10% quartz in them because it's a basic igneous rock, very low in silica. And these are really beautiful soils. Generally, the less quartz you have, the more space you have really for more nutrient-rich minerals. So they're beautiful soils to dig, nutrient-rich. I've even heard reports of people growing melons on the Isle of Mull in their basaltic soils in polytunnels. So some of my favourite soils on this Dar-Leith association. So second in the list is Plagioclase. Now Plagioclase is probably the second or the most abundant rock forming mineral on Earth, and it's a framework silicate that exists either as a pure sodium plagioclase or a pure calcium plagioclase called albite and an orthite respectively, or they can be anything in between. They can have a mix of the two in some kind of what we call a solid solution. And these plagioclase minerals are often the main sources of sodium and calcium in our soils when you look at the total concentrations, but that wouldn't necessarily reflect in the phytoavailable concentrations because these nutrients are locked up within a resistant framework silicate structure. And you don't usually find these minerals in the sand and silt size fractions before they're weathered down into other clay minerals that would then be found usually in the clay size fraction. And on the map of plagioclase, we find that the Countess Wells Association in bright red here, centered upon the northeast, has about 30% plagioclase in its composition on average. And we also have the Outer Hebrides and the Loch Inver Association with a similar plagioclase content. Countess Wells, I should add, is soils developed from granitic paramaterium, so intrusive igneous rock. And out here on the Outer Hebrides, Alan touched upon it, you've got the Lewisian gneiss, which is metamorphosed granite. So that explains why these soils have such a high content of plagioclase. Our third group of minerals actually contains two minerals, muscovite and illite. And I've grouped these together because they have very similar crystal structures. So they can be quite hard to tell apart from one another without quite detailed mineral analysis. So they both belong to a group of phyllosilicates, so sheet silicates, which are also referred to as clay minerals. But rather confusingly, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're clay sized. So mica or muscovite mica minerals, such as this picture, can exist as very large crystal structures. So despite being a clay mineral, whereas illite is more of a weathering product and would usually be clay sized. So that's an important difference between the two. They both contain a lot of potassium, and illite in particular would be a very good source of phytoavailable potassium and other essential nutrients due to it having quite a considerable cation exchange capacity. And when we look at the spatial distribution of these groups, this group of minerals, we see a hotspot in the northeast, in the Audley and Fowland associations. And these are soils developed from metamorphosed argillaceous rocks, which just means clay-bearing rocks, such as schists, biolites. So these soils might contain about 20 to 25% of this mineral group in the mineral composition. And then in the southern uplands, we have this quite large association called the Ettrick Association, which represents soils developed from another clay-bearing rock called Greywacke, which contains like quite angular quartz and feldspar particles kind of encased within a clay matrix. So that explains why we have higher concentrations there as well. So number 4 in our list is potassium feldspar, and this is like the potassium-rich cousin of the plagioclase minerals that we looked at a couple of slides back. And these are the main source of total potassium in many soils. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean that those soils contain much phytoavailable potassium, because the potassium locked up within these potassium feldspar minerals is really resistant to break down. Even aqua regia struggles to extract potassium from these minerals. And they're usually sand to silt size before they're then broken down subsequently into clay minerals. But given the young nature of Scottish soils, there hasn't been much time for that to take place. There are still signs of it, but nothing like what you might find elsewhere with older soils. So on the map of potassium feldspar, the Countess Wells Association really stands out, again, just like it did with Plagioclase. So these granitic soils developed from intrusive igneous rock might have about 20% potassium feldspar within their mineral composition. So all of the bright red patches on this map are really associated with that association. Fifth group is another group of clay minerals. And this is the group of mixed layer clay minerals, which are interstratified layers of illite and smectite, also known as montmorillonite. And these are a group of 2-to-1 phyllosilicates, which summarizes their crystal structure and the way that the atoms are layered within their structure. And they're pretty much always clay sized, and therefore have considerable impacts on soil properties by acting as a source for nutrient absorption and formation of colloids. So they really do affect the way soil functions. And with respect to these minerals, it's the etric association that really stands out again. It was very much rich in muscovite and illite, and also that clay-bearing matrix of the greywacke seems to also be rich in these mixed layer clay minerals as well. And this was actually 400 to 500 million years ago. The southern uplands, before they were uplifted, were part of a marine environment. So these are marine sediments that are now forming this greywacke rock. Number 6 in our list is the Kalin group of minerals, which includes a few different minerals: kaolinite, halloysite, and dickite. And these are a group of phyllosilicates, so it's a group of clay minerals that are always clay sized, pretty much. You wouldn't find them as large particles outside of the clay fraction. So soils rich in kaolin would generally have a very heavy texture, but they wouldn't necessarily have a good ability to absorb nutrients, because Kalin group minerals don't have a very high cation exchange capacity compared to the 2-to-1 clay minerals that we've already touched upon. And when looking at the map of the Kalin group, it's very different to what we've seen for any other mineral group so far. We've got the central lowlands really stands out with the Rowan Hill Association, which covers much of this part of Scotland, containing about 15% kaolin, which represents soils developed from carboniferous sandstones. And in this area as well, we also have an association called the Stirling Association, which represents soils developed from ancient estuarine and lacustrine environments that show up with having some kaolin as well. So that's the Rowan Hill is the one that really stands out. So the last group of minerals that constitutes the 7 most common minerals found in Scotland is the Chlorite group. And these are really complex phyllosilicates that are known as having a 2-to-1-to-1 structure, or also known as a 2-to-2 structure. And that again just summarizes the way the silicon and aluminium layers are stacked upon one another within the structure. And these minerals are rich in magnesium and iron, and they don't, despite being a phyllosilicate or a clay mineral, again, they're not necessarily found in the clay size fraction. They can exist in quite large crystals or very, very small crystals. So that adds an extra layer of complication. And they're also quite vulnerable, if you like, to chemical weathering. So the fact that we do observe chlorite in the soils in Scotland is a sign that they are quite young, and the chlorite hasn't had a chance really to be weathered into subsequent products, which would be subsequent clay minerals. So looking at the rich associations with chlorite, this very much reflects what we found with illite and mica, in that you've got this hotspot in the northeast, and also the etric association standing out as well. And these are basically all formed from argillaceous or clay-bearing rocks. So in summary, I hope I've shown you that the soil mineral compositions in Scotland show substantial variation, and they do generally reflect the composition of the parent material. There has been some alteration, obviously, and within associations there is subtle variation as well that we weren't able to touch upon when looking at this scale. But another point I want to outline before I finish is that the clay minerals that I've identified today are not necessarily always clay sized, because of the way they're inherited from the parent material. And that means that understanding the mineral compositions of the soils, not just the particle size distributions, can really help to understand why soils have the properties they do. And with that, I'll finish with an acknowledgement to the Macaulay Development Trust that funded my research for a few years at the James Hutton Institute. And if you want to find more information about soil mineralogy and how the analysis can be done using the R programming language, there's a course online that I've written on the link on this slide. So thank you for your time, and I'll finish there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ben, and a great insight into the complexity and variability within the soils. So I'm pleased now to welcome Willie Towers, who's been monitoring the questions you've been sending in for our panelists. Hopefully you've got them all in. If you've got any final questions, get them in very, very quickly, and then that gives Willie a chance to get through everything. So over to you, Willie.
Okay, can everybody hear and see me? Hopefully.
Yeah, I can hear you, Willie.
That's great, thanks. Okay, a few questions come in, thankfully, and good. Firstly, for Alan, a couple of questions from a couple of attendees to the webinar. Are any of the data available online, and if so, which ones for using GIS?
Yep. It's on some of the slides I've put in some of the URLs, but the 250K soil map and associated data set is available online and free to download. The digitized 1 to 25,000 scale map is online and free to download. And the National Soil Inventory that was done between 1978 and 1988 is online and free to download. Essentially, you download them from the Hutton website, but probably the best place to look would be what's called Scotland Soils website. If you just type in Scotland Soils, it generally comes up first in the Google search. And from there, you'll find links to being able to download the data.
Okay, thanks, Alan. And just actually a follow-up to that. One question is, has the whole country now been mapped at 1 to 25,000 scale?
1 to 25,000, no.
Yeah.
It's the 1 to 25,000 scale is primarily the cultivated land and the adjacent upland. We're pretty much there with digitizing all the 25,000 scale maps. So the map that I showed with that white area is about as much as we're going to get at that resolution. Okay,
thanks, Alan. Okay, one for Ben now, and to me it strikes me as quite a big question. So here's a challenge for you, Ben. Do the different mineral groups manifest themselves in different soil microbiomes or soil biology?
Yeah, Great question. That's something I did actually look into a few years back. We had a nice data set with all the mineralogy of the Scottish soils and the bacterial genomic sequencing data, and we looked into it, and yes, it does. It certainly does. There is a certain effect. It's very hard to unpick the exact contributions of the minerals, because everything's linked to one another within soils. But one of the most striking different things we saw was there is a soil association in Scotland where the soils have developed on a parent material called serpentinite, and these soils are almost naturally contaminated due to the mineral composition they have. They've got very high concentrations of various heavy metals, and the microbial community on those soils was completely different to anything else in Scotland. So that was certainly driven by the mineralogy. The hardest thing when doing that work is trying to unpick what is simply due to pH change, which is the main driver of microbial communities, I think, and what's actually due to the surfaces of the minerals themselves.
Okay, thanks for that, Ben. Another one for Allan, actually. Do you ever redo surveys?
Redo surveys? Yes, on occasions we do. Generally, if we need to have more detailed information, so if we need to map it at a higher resolution. But also at the minute within the Hutton, we have an active group who are undertaking soil surveys in forestry areas, essentially using the forestry soil classification rather than the Scottish soil classification. So yeah, we do on occasions. It's not done very often, but it is done.
Okay, thanks, Allan. I know we revisited certain points across the landscape as well, but you did touch on that in your presentation. I've actually got one for you, Ben, from me personally. Was there any surprises to you between the associations and the mineralogy which emerged from it, or emerged in your work?
Yeah, I think I initially thought that there would be more variation within the associations. Having studied a couple in quite a lot of detail, generally the mineral compositions, certainly like the major groups of minerals, are very much similar across an association, and the variation really comes in just the slight changes, perhaps in the proportion of clay minerals, mainly due to soil type, really. So often glade soils that are often waterlogged and have a lot more interaction with water than well-drained soils would have more clay in, because there's been more opportunity for the minerals or inherited from the parent material to be broken down by water into new clay minerals. So that was the main surprise, really. I initially quite naively thought that there would be more variation than there is.
All right. Yeah. And also, just one last one for you, Allan, from me as well. You've been in this field now for 40 years. Is there any soil that really sort of inspires you? And if so, why?
Soil that inspires me and why? I mean, there are so many different soils that aesthetically look really nice. It's a really difficult one. I would have to think quite hard about that one to try and pick an individual soil that I really like. But yeah, sometimes you dig a hole and you look at it and you go, wow, but that could just be me.
Yeah, I know you mean, Allan, as we come from similar backgrounds. I think that's all the questions I've got for you both. I think we're almost out of time as well. So I'll hand over back to both now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Willie. So yeah, on behalf of the British Society of Soil Science, I would like to express our thanks to Alan and Ben for coming along to present today, 2 excellent presentations, and to yourself, Willie, for coordinating the question and answer session. I'd also like to thank Visit Britain and Nature Scott for supporting this webinar. And thank you all for attending. You'll find a quick feedback survey when you leave the webinar, which we hope you'll take time to complete, because that information is really useful for how we plan future sessions. And the recording of this video will also be available after the event on our YouTube channel. As I mentioned at the beginning, the World Congress of Soil Science will be held in Glasgow this year from the 31st of July to the 5th of August, and I do hope that we see you there. And also during this year, we'll be running 8 Zoom into Soil webinars. And the next one is taking place on Wednesday, the 2nd of March, and will feature the handsome gardener, who will focus on starting a garden from scratch, the progression that he's seen, and how to make it successful. And that's both above and below ground. And that webinar is now available for registration via our website. And we'll also send you a link out in our follow-up email. And so, yeah, finally, I really do hope we see you at future events. In the meantime, thank you again and goodbye.